Hello and welcome to Empathy HIT. Your host, Dr. Sandy Whitehouse, is the CEO and CMO of Ticket Health, an award-winning global provider of digital solutions for capturing data directly from and in communicating with vulnerable people within diverse populations. On this podcast, Dr. Whitehouse chats with providers, partners, and industry leaders on topics ranging from digital empathy to social determinants of health, to rethinking how we collect information critical to improving health outcomes.
Welcome to Empathy HIT, where today I'm honoured to speak with Evan Elkin. Evan is a nationally respected leader who has dedicated his working life on some of today's very pressing issues: juvenile justice reform, adolescent and family health, substance use treatment, and youth development. Evan has worked extensively helping to advance public health, equity and justice through innovation and the development of evidence-based practices. Originally trained as a psychologist at NYU in Columbia and past director of the Department of Innovation at the Vera Institute of Justice in New York City, Evan is currently the executive director of Reclaiming Futures, a national public organization focused on improving equity and justice for youth in schools, as well as child welfare and juvenile justice systems. Welcome, Evan.
Thank you, Sandy. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start. Reclaiming Futures has been studying and piloting ways to build a more equitable and effective public health-oriented approach to youth justice. As a strong advocate for restorative justice, can you speak about it and how it applies to what schools and community organizations are doing?
Sure. Well, I will start by saying that as a society and in terms of the systems that care for people and care for young people, we've had a chronic confusion. And we tend to entangle notions of what is wellness and what is normalcy and what does it mean to be healthy with our concepts of justice. And we do so in the kinds of decisions we make. So, for example, schools are tasked not only with teaching kids and adolescents, but maintaining a safe environment for learning. And almost all of them have sort of like their own embedded little justice system within the community of the school. Usually it's described as a discipline code. And what it really means is there are certain things that kids do or certain moments where the school decides that it's safer for the school if a kid is not there, and they tend to either discipline the kid, expel them, put them in a school detention. And so the ways that we'd make those kinds of decisions to keep the community safe by marginalizing some kids, excluding some kids from the learning environment, we sometimes do so in a way that doesn't appreciate the wellness of that kid, what brought them to behave the way that they do. So in a nutshell, that vignette describing the challenges faced by schools describes the nature of Reclaiming Futures work, is to appreciate that community setting and the demands of a community to remain safe and remain in a positive relationship with each other. And how do we do that and appreciate the needs that people have? And so a lot of the work that we do is about getting these systems to incorporate a sensibility of asking and inquiring how people feel, what brought them to feel the way that they do. And I think most people listening to this podcast might understand that we've had quite a recent and strong focus in the last, say, decade or so on the role that's played by trauma and adverse childhood experiences, or the experiences of families who are not as strong as they could be, and the ways that kids enter the community of school and as young adults as they enter society, the ways that those things influence the way that they feel and the way that they behave. And the fact that we have begun to appreciate the impact of trauma for kids of poverty and communities that are challenged by lots of trauma, and to take that into account before we make a justice decision. You asked about restorative justice. And I would expand the term to include what's really referred to now as restorative practice, which is a more broad term that refers to the ways that we, when faced with a challenge of holding someone accountable or understanding why a behavior took place that may have harmed someone, or even ahead of something like that happening, that we pay attention to the relationship that that person has with their community. And that when an event happens, someone harms someone, we attend first to their relationships to their community. So restorative justice is really about community wellness in our view. We see them as one and the same.
Thanks, Evan. I really respect your broad view of how young people fit into schools and community and the importance of family and how all of that goes together to make a single package rather than the silos that we often see. So moving on, we've been hearing a lot more about the convergence of education and healthcare, breaking down those barriers. And I know that Reclaiming Futures has developed a new screening and brief intervention model called ESPERT. How does restorative justice intersect with the social emotional learning and ESPERT?
Well, you're right that Reclaiming Futures has turned our attention to the school setting as an ideal place to intervene and to prevent the kind of difficulties that lead a young person maybe out of the school setting and into the justice setting. And in our view, the school to prison pipeline exists for a couple of major reasons. One is because it's a failure of recognizing and acting on the public health opportunity that exists in a place like school. I think there was a generation where not only were we not asking the right questions and asking kids how they felt and encouraging people to ask each other how they feel, and we were very quick to use the tools of discipline to respond to all things indiscriminately, whether they pertained to health and wellness and community wellness, or whether they pertained to some wrongdoing that truly needed to be dealt with in terms of accountability. So we've landed ourselves as an organization and our partnerships very much in school settings, and we're trying to build tools so that schools understand the connection between a truly restorative environment where relationships are seen as primary and that the checking in on mental health is not seen as a stigmatizing event. So among the tools that we have created are a way of beginning with those universal questions, which often are in the form of a screening tool, so that when those questions are asked, the right kinds of follow-up conversations ensue. So we've created some technology and a model for how school staff can follow up on what a young person says in response to a screener, so that it is a collaborative effort to move toward action of what to do next. Our major contribution has been to create a school-based model of what's called ESPERT, screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment. Is that BI part of ESPERT is the brief intervention, essentially a collaborative conversation with a young person. So we have implemented our model in quite a number of middle schools and some high schools, and soon we hope a large number of high schools around the country.
Thanks, Evan. So taking that public health approach and then applying it in schools with a very youth-friendly approach is both innovative and also a successful way to have that integration. But some schools feel that they lack the resources or wherewithal to support these types of programs. How do you respond to this challenge when confronted with it?
One answer that is the one that comes instinctively to mind is, can you afford not to? For a lot of environments, that is the paralysis that they feel, is that they're not well networked with counseling resources in their community. And so when we hear this and we think about the position that a school district administrator or a principal is in and feeling like, oh my God, how are we going to do this? We're not connected. We don't have counselors, or our counselors are overburdened, is to focus on the long-term benefits of preventing difficulty down the road. So we've now been in about 50 middle schools doing this. And the lessons we've learned about streamlining implementation and helping schools to rebuild their existing resources and systems around this kind of practice has really paid off. And it's those initial meetings where people freak out about cost and resources, and it falls away when they realize the kinds of supports that we've built around this kind of work.
I've heard that apart from improving school culture and that connectedness of young people with school, that there's some preliminary data around truancy and academics, and thinking that having this type of intervention may be able to impact those, as well as addressing issues of diversity and inclusion, which have really come to the fore over the last little while.
Well, I think all of those things are true. School connectedness is not an easy thing for people from all walks of life and from all ethnicities and races. Coming forward, it's a much taller order for a person from another country, and or families with historically adversarial relationships with schools. And we know who we're talking about. Kids of color are much more likely to be disciplined and expelled and marginalized for some of the reasons that we're much more likely to shift the lens and perceive problems as being mental health or wellness problems for white kids. So to assume that there are universally accepted concepts on both sides of the table that engaging in programs like this is safe and good is naive to the challenges that people from other cultures bring. So doing the work requires an enormous amount of cultural humility and challenging our assumptions. There's connection of people, and there's also connection of place. And many kids feel like their building is a reflection of the neglect that their communities have been subject to in these communities that have been divested in, the communities of color. The schools are not a welcome place.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done there. You've chosen digital empathy, which uses a personalized approach to collecting information to improve outcomes as the infrastructure for your screening technology. These tools, rather than taking a one-size-fits-all approach, transform the data collection process into a much more personalized experience. Where do you see the role of digital tools and digital empathy in dealing with the problems?
Well, a couple of things. I think our interest in that general concept and the model of digital empathy, meaning a responsive, not one size fits all, friendly and interactive and feedback delivering tool, dates back to a philosophy we had, which is the public health experience that we all have of having an initial screening of some kind is often a very passive and confusing experience. Young people experience screening tools very passively. You answer a series of questions. You're not told why these questions are important. You're not given any feedback necessarily about where you fall with your answers on not only compared to your peers, but they're also not given an opportunity to put their responses into personal context and to choose whether they want feedback. And so all of these things are elements that we have been integrating into our approach to screening by making them collaborative and interactive so that it feels in real time like a conversation. And so the tools that Ticket has created in collaboration with Seattle Children's Research Institute have those qualities. They have feedback. They have this trail of breadcrumbs that a young person can follow if they choose toward more information. But the way that the tools are constructed, they invite curiosity and they invite that conversation-like feeling just with the tool itself. And that's before we sit down with them for our brief intervention.
So what impact have you found, Evan? What have the results shown?
Well, one of the major things that we find is the SBIRT process, the screening and brief intervention and the use of these tools in and of itself is actually something that generates a feeling of greater connection to the school. So kids who go through a process like this later will tell you, I feel more connected to my school experience and to the adults in the building than I did before. I felt heard, I felt understood, and I feel more connected to caring adults. And those are well-known predictors and cofactors for better outcomes for young people. Another really stunning finding is that up to 50% of kids who talk about having symptoms or signs of distress amenable to treatment are previously unknown to people in the building. So not taking anything away from school counselors and what they do and the attunement and sensitivity of teachers, but those that thought they knew everyone. This kind of program, it doesn't prove them wrong, but it helps them to see that there are quite a few kids whose issues were previously unknown. And it's a very satisfying feeling, especially when that indicator, that unknown factor, is something of an urgent nature, like self-harm or someone is feeling unsafe or is suicidal.
Well, I think what you're saying also is that the staff, although it may be challenging to their traditional way of doing things, that they're actually seeing that this is enhancing what they're doing and providing the results that are making their work even more meaningful rather than that taking away.
Absolutely. And the restorative stuff we were talking about earlier applies to these adults in the room too. So they feel more connected and more understanding of who they're working with. I think it's really enlightening and has a positive wellness effect on the adults in the building too.
Yeah, I think we talked earlier on about schools and community as something separate. And really, one of the things it looks like you're working towards is that the school is community or part of the community. And so we want to decrease the separation between the school and the community and the family. And that this work is embracing all of that.
That's true. And I think in order to achieve that, you do need to recognize the barriers for certain subsets of the kids in the building for them to feel like their community and their identity as a community is welcome in the building. As a part of our work, we also promote the inclusion of community-based organizations that represent the kids of color and other ethnicities to take part in this process in some way, both the restorative work, the public health work, the counseling, and to bring these community-based agencies into the building and allow for a permeable membrane. I think more and more schools are understanding in order to have an equitable system of care for their young people, they need to open their doors to family and to community and not be so adversarial.
Yeah. There's a whole other conversation we could have around the impact of COVID on this whole process, but I think we'll move on. One of the things looking forward to hearing from you as well. You've had a long professional journey and it's been very inspiring with lots of experience. And I was interested to know what some of the pit stops that have really kept you fired up and motivated along the way.
Well, I have to say is the eye-opener and the light bulb around equity and the fact that we don't know the perspectives of the people that we most want to serve until we ask them. And some of the community-based work that I've done, in particular, work with tribal communities, where it's really interesting as separate nations and with their own language and culture and the history of trauma and oppression that they've had, their voice is critically important. And they are probably the best example of the principle of how public health equity is important, because if we use our frame of reference, our definitions of wellness, our definitions of what it means to successfully and safely go from childhood to adulthood, if we don't ask and we don't allow for the voices and the cultural definitions to enter into the work, then we really are missing the point and we're continuing to oppress people. So my work with tribal communities has been really, really enlightening and gratifying for that reason. It's the lesson of listening.
Yeah, that's an important one for all of us. I really commend you on the work that you're doing and collaborating with you going forward. It's a very exciting time with a lot of opportunities as the world is transitioning in all sorts of ways. So thank you very much for your insights and wisdom, and thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you for joining us today. You can follow the conversation on Empathy HIT on Healthcare Now Radio or at tickethealth.com or at #DigitalEmpathy. And be sure to follow Dr. Whitehouse on Twitter at Sandy Whitehouse.